It's a social studies lesson about the desegregation in Boston in the 1970s. This portion that you'll be seeing is directly following a Do Now, in which I had the students write down their thoughts on race and race relations in their schools and in Boston currently. And I'm also assuming that we did a lesson earlier in the week about the Little Rock desegregation crisis. So here we go. Alright, so now that you've written down those things, we're going to segue. Earlier in the week we talked about Little Rock desegregation. And let's see, Meredith, can you tell me which Supreme Court case led to that?
The Supreme Court case was Brown versus Board of Education?
Yes, correct. Good. And Peter, do you remember what year that was?
It was like 1960?
A little bit before. Meredith, can you help him out?
1954, I think?
54. Perfect. So, 1954, we had Brown versus the Board. And that case was important because it said that Little Rock Central High School could not be segregated with only white students, and that the school district had to mix their students, whites and blacks, and all students had to be going to the same schools. So it was also important not just for Little Rock, but because it said that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. So with that, Supreme Court saying that, what do you think would start happening? If they're saying separate facilities are inherently unequal, what do you think would start happening maybe? Let's see, can we hear from you?
I would think that they would start putting kids of all races in the same school.
Yeah, right, that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
If keeping them separate is illegal, you'd probably want to start mixing them to be, right?
More equal.
Right, exactly. But not quite what happened. See, there were a lot of people, as we saw in the Little Rock case, that really were resistant and opposed to this mixing, this integration of schools. In Little Rock, you had just 9 black students wanting to go to a school, whereas all white students, and the huge riots, the throwing rocks at each other, and that was just for 9 people. So imagine if the whole school starts getting integrated. So a tricky way that these people who were opposed would get around it is that the Supreme Court case actually only specified that de jure segregation, which is a Latin phrase meaning by the law. So the Supreme Court's case was really saying that segregation where in the laws it said black and white students couldn't be together, that was not okay. But people would get around that because de facto segregation, and that's another Latin term meaning just the way it is, pretty much. So because of neighborhood inequality and housing patterns, black families sort of tended to live in one area and white families would live in the other, so they'd be segregated, but it wasn't written in the law that they had to be. So the schools could sort of, the black neighborhoods could have their own schools and white neighborhoods could have their own schools, and then that would just sort of end up being segregated even though it's not written into a law anywhere. So they would get around it by keeping the schools like that. So now that you know that, can I hear what you guys wrote down in the beginning of the class? We'll start with you.
Well, I feel like our schools are pretty well mixed. There's people of all different races and everything.
Right.
Not a bad thing.
Yeah, I feel like everyone gets along. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, so right now just segregated schools don't really seem like it's happening anymore, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you might be surprised to hear that Boston, right next to where we are, it used to be one of the most segregated areas in almost the whole country. You often think of the South and that being like really where the race relations were hard, but right here in Boston, the schools were really, really resistant to being integrated. So it wasn't until the 1970s actually that something started to be done about that. And Boston had sort of a system of segregation where it wasn't written into the law. So, let's see. Tom, do you remember what that would be called?
Oh, if it's not in the law, that would be de facto.
De facto, yes. Great. So Boston had a de facto system of segregation. So they just sort of had their own neighborhoods, and the biggest ones were South Boston, which is mainly white, and Roxbury, which is mainly black. So in 1974, there was a U.S. judge named Arthur McGarry, and he said that this segregation, even though it was de facto in Boston, was illegal and it violated the equal protection laws in the Constitution. So this is in 1974, just 20 years after the Supreme Court said that this was no longer okay. So it took a long time, and even when he did make that ruling, nothing really started happening.